two of the people that were sewing. They worked on the 9th floor.
The 9th floor of the factory was arranged so that every possible space was taken up by a sewing machine. About 300 machines were crowded on tables with barely elbow room between them. It was a disaster waiting to happen. The people working on the floor that day were totally unprepared when the fire exploded into the space. Panicking workers struggled toward the exits, which were soon blocked, leaving the small passenger elevators as the only way out.
My name is Dennis Clancy. I'm the great-great-grandson of Joseph Zito. He was one of the 2 elevator operators that day. He was about to get off work, and the bell for the elevator started ringing incessantly. When he gets to the 9th floor, the women are frantic. They're fighting to try to get on the elevator because there are flames behind them. The elevator was only supposed to hold about 12 people, but on some of those trips that he made, they had near double that. Each time he went back up, he could see the flames that were above him. He was going into the fire to save those people that he knew would die if he wasn't able to get back up there. He saved over 100 people that day. Eventually, people were so desperate to get off of the 9th floor. People were jumping into the elevator shaft when the car was not there, so they'd end up landing several stories down on the top of his elevator car. Finally, the weight of all these people on top of it was too much for the elevator car to continue to make trips, and it ended up slipping down to the basement. When he had his elevator car full and he had to make that trip down, seeing all those people's faces who were still stuck on the 9th floor, seeing the flames behind them, seeing women in windowsills about to jump to their death, Zito said he would never be able to get this image out of his head.
By now, workers had started appearing on the window ledges of the 9th floor. The crowd on the street below implored them to hold on as the fire department raised their ladders. But then the realization set in. The ladders were too short. They only reached as far as the 6th floor, almost 30 feet below the trapped 9th floor workers.
My name is Erica Lansner, and my great-aunt Fanny Lansner died in the fire. She was a forelady on the 9th floor. So Fanny, in her role as supervisor, tried to usher as many people as she could into the elevator. She remained the sort of beacon of calmness while there was so much panic going on around her. There were several women who tried to get her to run to the other side towards the Green Street exit where the stairwell was still passable, and she refused to go. She put all of the girls' well-being and safety ahead of her own. She was really one of the heroes of the fire. She fully expected for the elevator to come back and get her. It had already made 8 or 9 trips, and it was not possible.
Meanwhile, thousands of New Yorkers had gathered on the street 90 feet below the burning factory. Many of them remembered seeing what appeared to be large bundles of cloth being thrown from the building's upper floors. The owners were protecting their goods, they thought. But when one of the bundles opened to reveal a woman's legs, the full horror became apparent. They were jumping. The girls were jumping.
My name is Stacy Silverstein, and my great-grandmother, Sylvia Riegler, survived the fire. She was in the dressing room changing into her street clothes after the closing bell rang, and her good friend Rose Feibush ran in a panic, screaming, pulled her out of the dressing room, through the shop. Rose was pulling her towards the window, and even as a child, Sylvia had a great fear of heights. So she broke free from Rose, ran the opposite way. And she said, my beautiful friend, Rose Feibush, jumped from the window. and Sylvia just remembered not being allowed to cross the street because the bodies were falling. She watched her friends and coworkers falling from the windows, some of them holding hands, some of them hugging. That's not something you can ever forget.
The scenes on Washington Place and Green Street would stay with eyewitnesses forever. One reporter described how a young man helped young women up to the windowsill as if he were helping them into a streetcar instead of eternity. As groups of girls jumped together, they hit the ground with such force that they crashed right through the glass partition in the sidewalk. 18 minutes after the fire started, the last body fell to the ground. In all, more than 90 people jumped to their deaths.
When I was a child, my grandmother told me that her cousin Rose had died in the Triangle Fire. It was clear from the fact that she died of injuries at St. Vincent's Hospital that she's one of the people who had jumped from that building. This was a very deeply felt tragedy for my grandmother because you could see it in her face, you could hear it in her voice. A deep, deep sadness, a faraway look, and she just would say, finally, what can you do? And I took that to mean that it was too late to save Rose. She was just gone and there was nothing that could be done about it, but we weren't going to forget that. This shouldn't have happened. It just shouldn't have happened.
Outside the Ash Building that day, New York Fire Chief Edward Croker was seeing his most dire predictions come true. For years, his pleas for improved fire safety had fallen on deaf ears. And when firefighters entered the building, they discovered how sadly accurate his warnings had been.
I'm Raymond Ott. I'm a New York City fire marshal. My grandfather, Andrew Ott, was a fireman. He was one of the first responders to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. My grandfather told me that women were jumping out the window, holding on to their pocketbooks. People were yelling, "Don't jump, wait." He was in part of the recovery. They had to take the bodies and move them. He saw people melted together. I was at 9/11 and I was watching the people jump. It would be like 1, 2, 3, people would jump out. It must have been very similar to what my grandfather saw that day. Chief Croker had lobbied to make the workplace safer. After a fire in Newark a few months earlier, there were numerous things they could have done. Fire drills existed at the time, but they weren't mandated. It was their option to do it. And a lot of places wouldn't do it because it would interrupt their work time. Sprinklers would have controlled the fire to give the people time to get out, but they just couldn't force a company to put sprinklers into their building. The bottom line is, if there's no regulations, people will cut corners and they'll take the chance.
As panicked people rushed to Washington Place to get news of their relatives, firefighters searched the Ash Building for survivors and began the task of removing the dead. Coroner Herman Holzhauser was there to supervise. Despite being a veteran of the most abhorrent crime scenes, he was overwhelmed. The New York Times reported that he sobbed like a child, lamenting that girls who had been carried up to work in an elevator that morning were now coming down charred on the end of a rope. In the street, the police solemnly collected the scattered belongings of the victims. It had only been a matter of months since they had fought viciously with these same workers on the picket lines as they campaigned for better conditions. Now, they were carrying them away in makeshift coffins.
My
name's Elizabeth Wilson, and my grandfather's brother was Joseph Wilson, and he died in the Triangle Fire. He ran out of the building and ran back in because he forgot his father's gold pocket watch. This was a prized object from Russia and probably the most valuable possession that the family had because they were really an extremely poor family. But he ran back in to get it, and he never made it out. He was engaged to be married to Rosie Solomon, and she was a young woman, about 18 years old. She had planned to meet Joseph that night, and he never arrived, and she knew about the fire. Everybody knew about the fire. The next day, which was Sunday, she was in line early in the morning, along with hundreds of other people waiting to view the bodies. And she finally got in. It was late afternoon, and she came to box 34. She recognized a ring, and she asked the attendant if there would have been a pocket watch, and they produced a pocket watch, and they opened it up, and her picture was inside. At that point, she just became hysterical and collapsed and had to be carried out.
Many of the badly burned corpses proved difficult to identify. One family claimed their daughter by noticing the cork inserts in her shoes. One mother recognized her child by the way her stocking was stitched. A young girl recognized her mother's hair because she had braided it for her the morning of the fire. Day after day, a succession of hearses pulled out of the morgue as families claimed their dead and began burying them. On the Lower East Side and from Bedford Street to the Bowery, it seemed as if no block of downtown Manhattan had been spared a death. Violet Shockett on East 5th Street, Sadie Nussbaum on East 6th Street, Mary Floresta on East 13th Street. These were only three among the scores of funerals as the communities of the Lower East Side shared in their collective loss.
Everybody was known to everybody on the East Side then. The same people went to the same funerals every day.
The victims' stories dominated the newspapers for days, until early April, when all but 7 bodies had been laid to rest. With nobody able to identify them, a political battle broke out over what to do with these last 7 corpses. The union wanted to hold a public funeral, but the city refused to allow these unnamed victims to become martyrs to the cause of organized labor. Fearful of a mass demonstration, they planned to bury them in a city plot in Brooklyn. The unions were outraged. On April 5th, the same day as the city buried the unidentified out in Brooklyn,